That may have been the worst race of the season so far, but for completely selfish reasons, it was my absolute favourite race of the season. I think with these 2022 regulations, we've been spoiled by some great battles, some enthralling races, but Mexico brought us back down to earth very quickly. Let's break it down. Let's talk about my 3 winners and 3 losers from this weekend's Mexican Grand Prix. It's difficult to start basically any of these reviews without talking about Red Bull, and in particular our double world champion Max Verstappen just again looked so incredibly good in qualifying. It looked like it was going to go down to the wire with his competitors, but he managed to pull out 3/10 on Russell in second place. It was just incredible. Then when it came to the race, his quality just made it look so comfortable, as it has many times this season. Got himself into the lead at the start and never really looked back. There was lots of talk of him being under pressure into turn 1 in particular, but that Red Bull is just so quick in a straight line. And with the altitude, the slipstream isn't as effective either, so he just sailed off into the distance. Then the big debate was whether or not he was going to go for a stop for a second time. With that Red Bull being so good on its tyre wear, though, he managed to make the strategy, which even Pirelli said wasn't possible. Coming across the line almost 15 seconds ahead of Lewis Hamilton in second place, and with another victory in the bag, he breaks even more records. First off, he broke the record for outright most wins in a season with 14 out of 20 this year, beating the record held by Vettel and Schumacher on 13 each. But Schumacher did that in 18 races, so to match the win percentage, he still has to win the final 2 races of the year. So there'll always be some debate around that if he doesn't manage to do it, but there can be no debate over the fact that he's also broken the record for the most points in a season. Lewis Hamilton had the record in 2019, where the 7-time world champion scored 413 points. Verstappen finds himself on 416 with 2 races and a sprint race left to go. He could absolutely demolish that record. I do just quickly want to mention his teammate Sergio Perez as well, because in all of this, he's been a massive help to Max Verstappen in picking up these records, and the team dynamic that Red Bull have at the moment is just perfect right now. It was just great to see the Mexican obviously on the podium in his home country, especially in that baseball stadium where the podium ceremony is held. Mexico has some incredible fans, and it just seems like celebrating with them in that way. The Mexican Formula 1 theme song too, it just couldn't get any better. Let's move on to our first losers from the Mexican Grand Prix, and it quite clearly has to be Ferrari. The car just could not handle the higher altitude of this track, whether it was the engine and the lack of oxygen that they could channel into it, or whether it was the aero package that didn't have the downforce that they were expecting. I haven't looked into it yet, but the car was just nowhere near the pace we've expected from it in 2022. Let's not forget that this is a Ferrari team that's picked up 12 pole positions this season, the most they have ever had in a season since 2004. The car is absolutely rapid on one lap, and they should really be comfortably second in the Constructors' Championship, but that gap now slips to 40 points with 2 races left to go, and that gap is definitely not unsurmountable considering the pace Mercedes have found recently. Charles Leclerc also drops behind Sergio Perez again in the Drivers' Championship to 3rd place. Those two have been swapping places seemingly every race at this point though, and the gap between them's only 5 points with 60 points still up for grabs, so could easily go either way. But on top of that, Carlos Sainz now slips into 6th place in the Drivers' Championship, and I know that he's had a very up and down season and didn't finish the last 2 races prior to Mexico in Japan and Austin, but it just seems crazy to me that Ferrari have slipped so far from battling for the championship earlier on in the season to now clinging on to 2nd place in the Drivers' Championship and Constructors' Championship. So what feels like a bit of an anomaly race where Ferrari were just so far off the pace of the top 4 in Mexico actually has a pretty detrimental effect for the team in the championships because of those hardships that they had earlier on in the season. And whilst we talk about Ferrari possibly slipping down the order, on the flip side of that, we have my second winners in Mercedes continuing this rejuvenation that they seem to be having towards the end of this season. Let's talk about Lewis Hamilton first, as he keeps knocking on the door of picking up his first victory this season. Coming into the weekend, Red Bull had 15 wins, Ferrari had 4, but Lewis Hamilton has won a race in every single year of his Formula 1 career, but that clock is ticking in 2022 with 2 races left to go. Although one thing you can't argue with is that he's been incredibly close over recent weeks. Both of the Mercedes cars slotting in behind Max Verstappen on the grid, Lewis Hamilton had got the better of his teammate George Russell through the first 3 corners, and then it was just the task of trying to hold on to the back of Verstappen and put pressure on the Red Bull team, which he did perfectly. Kept himself within touch and distance throughout the first stint, even on the slower tyres, and then went on to a different strategy, went for a 1 stop when the prediction was 2 stop for Verstappen. Hamilton did everything right, and it was just unfortunate that the Red Bull held on to those medium tyres so well for the entire race that this culmination of strategy we were expecting towards the end just never really came true. Russell also had a great weekend. In qualifying, he believed that he had the pace for pole position if it wasn't a mistake in those final few corners just as he entered the baseball stadium towards the end of the lap. And then in the race, possibly should have been 3rd, but opened the door to Sergio Perez whilst battling with teammate Lewis Hamilton. And once he was in 4th, he was pretty much stuck there. Obviously, that win still eludes them, but there are so many positives for the team. Russell builds quite a nice gap. Carlos Sainz now with a 29-point lead over the Spaniard, and Lewis Hamilton also moves in front of him by 4 points too, meaning that the team slot in 40 points behind Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship and within touching distance now. If Mercedes can come home second in the Constructors' Championship through purely being consistent and opportunistic this season, that bodes incredibly well for the team if they can find that extra 10th or 2 next year. Talking in next year, my next loser, Fernando Alonso, probably cannot wait for the season to end. The first half of the season was plagued with reliability problems for Alonso's car, and he himself has spoken so much about the number of points that he believes he should have had this season, which have just kind of slipped away from him because of Alpine. He has put together a lot of best-of-the-rest performances and even became a mainstay in the points for the second half of the season, breaking through that Bottas barrier in the standings and catching his teammate race after race. Mexico, however, was just not meant to be. He picked up his 5th retirement of the season whilst running well in the points, in 7th place again as best of the rest, and engine problems saw him slow down initially, fall behind teammate Ocon and McLaren's Daniel Ricciardo, but his race ended on lap 66, a puff of smoke came out of the back of that Alpine car as he was headed down in towards turn 1, and it was all over and done with. In his words, car 14 stops again. Interestingly, that does give Ocon a lead of 11 points going into the final 2 races of the season, and Alonso now runs the risk of being outscored over the course of a full season for the first time in his career by his teammate. Although if it does come back to that, the Spaniard already has been talking about how the team has cost him up to 70 points this season, so it's not really his fault. Let's move on to our third and final winner, who has to be Daniel Ricciardo. He was driving like the Daniel Ricciardo of old, and it was incredible to watch. In a snoozy, late-night Mexican Grand Prix, I don't think many of us would have expected Daniel Ricciardo to be the driver providing the entertainment, considering the season that he's had so far. And it might seem strange to put him in the winners category, considering he picked up 2 penalty points on his license for a collision with Yuki Tsunoda. The McLaren driver was trying to pass the AlphaTauri on the inside of turn 6, which, to be fair, is a really weird place to go for a move, but the pair then made contact. Yuki Tsunoda was forced to retire from the race due to side pod damage, and they handed out Daniel Ricciardo a 10-second time penalty, which I think the Australian took personally, as he scythed through the field in front of him on the soft compound tyre and finished the race in 7th place, 12 seconds ahead of Esteban Ocon, so the penalty made no difference to his finishing position at all. It was great to see Danny so optimistic and so confident going for these overtakes on the likes of Norris and Ocon. It just shows that although the form may be temporary with Daniel Ricciardo, the right car, the right conditions, and his class is permanent. Last but not least, my final loser, I've gone for Aston Martin. This might be a little bit harsh, as Aston Martin most definitely have been probably the most improved team over the course of the season so far, and their levels just dipped slightly in Mexico. Vettel had picked up driver of the day in the last 2 Grand Prix, and the team were looking at 6th place in the Constructors' Championship, being within reach, and then in Mexico they were just nowhere. After battling with each other at the start, they couldn't really get to grips with the Mexican track and the challenges that come with being at such altitude, and it just never looked like points were anywhere near possible. So a harsh loser, as they set their own expectations so high recently, but still a loser for me. Let's round up our winners and losers with some honourable mentions, and there were quite a few from the Mexican Grand Prix. Bottas has to be a winner for me with that points finish. 10th place, maybe sparking some hope for Alfa Romeo and the setup for 2023. Yuki Tsunoda was running really well, but was taken out by Daniel Ricciardo, so it felt like a loss to the Japanese driver, but not really his fault. Alex Albon has to be a win in 12th place on a track that really doesn't suit that Williams car. A great drive from him. And finally, it's a loser spot for Nicholas Latifi, who was the only car on track to be lapped twice and was just so slow. That rounds up my winners and losers from the Mexican Grand Prix. It was a little bit of a snooze fest in the end, but if you didn't catch it, I was over on the last lap for the race, and of course have the podcast dropping with them later on in the week too. Thank you so much to those guys, and thank you so much to you guys who came by and represented the channel in the chat as well. It was incredible to see some of you stop by. As always, leave me a comment with your winners and losers down in the comments below. Whilst you're down there, hit a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and I'll see you next time.